You step into a pharmacy for medicine, for a cure, but what if you come out with something else entirely, something that can't be treated? Welcome to Horror Sector. Tonight, we're opening after hours to reveal 4 true tales from the other side of the counter where the night shift is a sentence and the most haunting prescriptions aren't found on any shelf. Stay with us if you dare to hear what happens when the lights go down and the familiar becomes frightening. 3 days ago, one of the strangest things of my life happened to me. The context is simple. My parents are elderly, and I've been taking care of them for several years. Their health isn't the best, but last night my father had a respiratory crisis, and I took him to the emergency room at the hospital so they could treat him. As soon as I arrived, they told me that they didn't have a number of medications to treat him, and that I would have to buy them. I was with my wife at the time, and she told me she would stay with my parents while I went to the pharmacy to buy what they needed. I sped off in the car, but to my horror, many of the pharmacies near the hospital were closed, even though they were supposedly 24-hour pharmacies. I kept driving straight until I finally reached a chain pharmacy that I was sure would serve me. I walked straight to the window from my car. There wasn't a single employee behind it. Keep in mind that at that moment my patience was completely broken. All I could think about was that my dad was dying in the emergency room of a rundown hospital and no one was helping us. I honked the horn in desperation and sped around again. And this time, someone was behind the window, a fair-skinned girl with rather large, quite blue eyes. I got out of the car and told her I needed a list of medications that the doctor had given me. I told her very urgently, but she remained calm and, while she looked for everything, kept apologizing, saying that her colleague was in the bathroom with a stomach bug, and that's why she hadn't been able to see me sooner. The precision with which she handed me everything caught my attention, as did the fact that she was giving me things one at a time without me even having paid for them. When she finished giving me everything they asked for, I tried to take out my debit card to pay, but I realized with anguish that in the rush of getting my dad out of the house, I had left my wallet and even my cell phone. I had no way to pay. She shook her hands with a very warm smile on her face. I told her anxiously that I didn't have any cash, almost crying, but she told me not to worry and to go. She told me to go and save my dad. She never told her who I was buying everything for or what was going through my mind. She just guessed. For a moment, all my urgency vanished, and I wanted to stay and ask her what she had said and how she knew, but as if she were reading my mind again, she pointed ahead and told me to hurry. I was truly confused, but I did as she said. I got in my car and drove back to the hospital. Fortunately, I arrived on time. My father was stabilized, and they were able to treat him properly. My mother and my wife went home, and I stayed with my father for the rest of the night. As the hours passed and I calmed down, the memory of that pharmacist started to haunt me. For starters, she wasn't at the window from the beginning if her colleague was in the bathroom. But then, there was her pale, blonde appearance, her calm way of speaking, and most importantly, the fact that she didn't want to charge me and that she also guessed what was wrong with me with such uncanny accuracy. I decided that as soon as my wife and mom got back to relieve me, I'd go back to the pharmacy to pay for what I'd bought and thank them. The problem was, when my wife and mom arrived, it was already 7 a.m. I went back to the pharmacy, which was already open, to go inside, and they told me the shift had changed an hour earlier. I asked them what time the overnight shift started, and after giving me a very strange look, they said around 10 o'clock. For the rest of the day, I tried not to think about it. In the afternoon, I went back to the hospital, and thankfully my dad was doing well. At 11 o'clock, a nurse told me I should let him sleep. I took advantage of the situation, and around 11:30 I headed to the pharmacy to find out the identity of the pharmacist who had helped me. When I passed by the window, she wasn't there, but a tall, dark-haired, somewhat pale young man. He looked a bit unwell, which reminded me that the old woman had told me his colleague did indeed have a stomachache. I approached him and asked if his colleague was around, as I wanted to thank her for helping me the day before. The look of confusion and bewilderment that the young man gave me made me feel cramps in my hands. When I finished speaking, the young man politely asked me, "Sir, what are you talking about? Are you sure it was at this pharmacy?" I insisted that yes, I had been there the day before and that a woman had served me, since her colleague, that is, the young man in front of me, had an upset stomach. When I mentioned that detail, he turned even paler than he already was, but insisted that he was alone in the pharmacy and that he was always alone, on every shift. He immediately thought someone had broken in to steal, and that they sent me away as a kind of act of help, but I told him I was wearing my uniform, that I wasn't just any woman. The young man called his manager, and I don't know what they talked about, but in the end, the young man calmed down. He charged me for what I had taken the day before and told me everything was fine. When I asked him what had happened, he simply told me his manager convinced him that strange things sometimes happened and that it was best to just let it go, get paid, since the products I mentioned were probably missing from the inventory, and that we shouldn't make a big deal out of it. I paid and left a few minutes later, convinced that something very strange had happened. As far as I'm concerned, real or not, that woman saved me that night from losing my father. And wherever she is, I'm grateful for what she did. My name is Camila, and for 2 weeks I worked at a pharmacy in my town. I'm from a very small place in northern Uruguay, near the border with Brazil. And the pharmacy where I started working is quite well known in my town because, well, it's practically the only one. There are 2 other pharmacies, but they're small and were never open after 10 p.m. So when a real emergency arises, everyone goes to the pharmacy where I worked. It's big. Obviously it sells medications, but it also has a perfume section, rents medical equipment, wheelchairs, crutches, a couple of nebulizers, and so far an orthopedic bed. In the afternoon it was full of retirees, and at night it got quite busy. I clearly remember that I started on a Monday afternoon shift. An older woman, Doña Marta, the owner of the pharmacy, showed me everything I needed to know. She gave me a vest, showed me the system, how the cash register worked, and where everything was. Everything was normal, except for a strange feeling that I've preferred to blame the first day nerves for a chill that wasn't coming from any air conditioning. The first thing happened on Wednesday, around 8 p.m., when the sun had already set and there was no line left at the pharmacy. My colleague, a rather quiet guy I'll call Guy, went to the back room and I was left alone behind the register, my gaze lost in the area where the medical supplies were on display. There was a manual blood pressure monitor, one of those with the bulb, which we used to take the readings of those who needed it. On the other side of the pharmacy, a woman was looking for something in the refrigerators, and then without anyone touching it, I heard the characteristic sound of the blood pressure monitor's bulb trying to inflate, as if someone were trying to pump air into it, but there was no one near the monitor. I swear, the bulb wasn't pressed, nobody had their finger on it, and yet, from where I was standing, I could see the little clock jump to 120, and a second later, the valve opened with a loud pop that made me jump. It must be broken. I came out from behind the register and took it down to check it, and everything was in order. I hung it back up, and Gil asked me what I was looking at. I told him what happened, and he just smiled at me before telling me not to worry about those things. On Friday, they sent me to the back room to organize the crutches by size and all that. The crutches were resting on a metal rack, side by side, securely mounted, but in a jumble. I arranged them from shortest to longest, and as I handed over a roll of labels, I heard the sharp click of aluminum against tile. One crutch fell for no apparent reason, since, as I said, they were resting securely on the rack. I went to pick it up, and right in front of me, a second one slid off as if someone had barely tugged on the handle, then another and another. I ended up with 5 crutches on the floor. There was no draft. The window was only slightly ajar. Gil appeared in the doorway, saw me bent over, and said something like, "Those always fall over. They're not supported properly." I wanted to believe her, although I was actually quite nervous by that point. I secured them more tightly. That night, Marta asked me to move the rack a little closer to the wall, just in case, so the customers wouldn't be startled by the noise if the crutches fell over. Obviously, something was wrong with those crutches, because during the 2 weeks I worked there, they kept falling over. On Saturday, shortly before the shift change, I was finishing up. I pressed the total button on the cash register, and the drawer opened with its usual bell. I walked to the back room to put the money in the petty cash box. When I heard the cash register buzz again, I thought I must have left it open. I pushed it until I heard the click. I took 2 steps and heard it again. This time, I just stood there staring at it. Mrs. Marta had left hours ago. The guy who worked the night shift hadn't arrived yet, and Gil had left about 15 minutes earlier. I was alone, so no one could be playing that trick on me. I nudged it with the side of my hand, and this time it stayed closed. 5 minutes later, the guy from the early morning shift arrived. I wished him good night and went home to sleep. The following Monday, around 8 o'clock, or maybe a little earlier, I was working outside. I called out and a customer brought back a rental wheelchair. I put it away, folding it up next to the others with the brakes on. I went back to the counter. A while passed, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that one of the chairs had moved a few centimeters into the aisle, as if someone had pushed it to get through. I walked over. I noticed that the brake was on, which bothered me a lot, since I couldn't explain how it had managed to move. That same night, with the clock striking 10, the label printer, the one we used to put names and prices on the products, started up on its own. We kept it stored in the back, but it made such a distinctive sound that I simply couldn't ignore it. The customer I was serving didn't even flinch. But when I finished with him, I walked to the back and saw that, sure enough, the gun on the table had gone off by itself. Coincidence or not, 3 crutches fell off their rack. I was a nervous wreck. I took a step and suddenly heard all the filing cabinet drawers slam shut in the office, one after the other, in a cascade. I was alone in the pharmacy and I let out a horrible scream that I think could be heard all over the street. I ran out of the pharmacy and called Mrs. Marta to tell her what had happened, and not long after, I called my father to tell him to come get me. Mrs. Marta tried to explain to me strange things kept happening over and over again. Gil simply ignored everything that went on, and I hadn't had a chance to ask the guy on the early morning shift if he'd noticed anything odd. Wednesday was the day I snapped. Mrs. Marta asked me to cover part of the early morning shift, promising to pay me quite well for the overtime. I reluctantly agreed. Outside, it was completely silent, and I couldn't wait for 2 o'clock so I could call my dad and ask him to come pick me up. Suddenly, I started hearing sharp, spaced-out thumps in the back room, like canes hitting the floor. I thought it was the crutches falling again or something, but then something new joined the chorus of sounds, like a muffled scream. That's when I got scared, but I figured someone had just broken in through the back. I rushed in, and the storeroom was empty. He told me that nothing was wrong, and that the guy from the early morning hours would be here any minute, but that I shouldn't leave the pharmacy unattended. To be honest, I don't know how she managed to convince me, but I went back into the pharmacy. At least my dad arrived a little while later and kept me company until the guy on that shift arrived. I stayed with him for a while, talking, and he told me that there had always been something strange about that pharmacy, but he'd learned to ignore it so he wouldn't get too scared and could work in peace. The next day, Mrs. Marta explained more or less the same thing to me, but she implied that it was harmless and that I should please try to ignore it. And I really did try. The following day, I went in for my shift with every intention of keeping my job, and everything was going relatively well until about 9 p.m. At that moment, the tension and the anticipation that something strange was going to happen made me feel very tired. I told Gilly I was going to the bathroom and went to wash my face. I wet the back of my neck, and when I looked up, I managed to see a face staring back at me from the stalls. I ran out of the bathroom and told Gil that there was someone in there. And when we came back, he said I must have mistaken one of the wastebaskets for a face. But for God's sake, I'm not crazy. The face was peeking out from under the door of one of the stalls and was as white as a sheet of paper. That same night, the cash register was opened 2 more times, and with everything that was happening, plus what happened on Wednesday, I decided I couldn't continue in that job. The next day, I spoke with Mrs. Marta. I apologized to her, but told her I couldn't continue. She was very understanding and told me she would pay me a little more than I was owed for those 2 weeks of work, but asked me to please try to be discreet and not spread the rumor around town. I agreed, and in fact, I'm still doing so, since that pharmacy is still open. I turned in the vest that same Friday. I counted the cash register one last time. I said goodbye to Gil's wife and left peacefully, knowing I wouldn't have to endure any more strange behavior in that pharmacy, and I never went back. In fact, whenever I needed to buy something, I preferred to go to another pharmacy or simply let my dad or one of my brothers go instead. I got a job a few days later. Sometimes, if I pass by the corner of the pharmacy, I see the fluorescent light on in the back, and I grab my forearm. Naturally, I ended up having nightmares about that place and constantly felt like something or someone was grabbing me while I slept. Luckily, that feeling disappeared as the weeks went by. My name is Anna, and I'm a pharmacist at a well-known chain. I've spent years behind the counter filling prescriptions, explaining dosages, and battling with the system when it crashes at midnight. There was someone who particularly made an impression on me, and that was a customer who, without fail, came to my window every Wednesday and some Fridays around 10 p.m. Dona Letty was in her 80s and had a smile that filled me with tenderness. She was thin, almost always wore the same gray coat, and carried a small cloth bag with a notebook and her glasses. She had her prescriptions carefully folded, with a long list of medications prescribed for her bones, diabetes, and especially her blood pressure. I clearly remember how she pointed to the names of the medications with a trembling finger, as if I didn't know them by heart. Losartan hydrochlorothiazide, which she hated because it made her run to the bathroom too often. The problem is that Dona Letty always bought only a small box for 7 days, and sometimes not even that. I noticed that occasionally she would stop buying medicine, and when I felt comfortable enough, I would mention it to her, and she would tell me that she still had some left, that a neighbor had given her some, and things like that. I had no reason not to believe her, but if she seemed really strapped for cash, I would have given her some from my own pocket so she could get another one. We became close in a relatively short time, since Dona Letty was very talkative. She would tell me stories about her neighbors and all that. And that's how I learned that she lived alone, that the boys worked far away and couldn't always send them to her. She also learned my schedule and would ask me if I had already eaten dinner, something very sweet of her, because she even made it a habit to bring me little gifts. Beyond that, there's not much to say. She was a polite lady, talked a lot, and was a customer who brightened my evenings. One week, 3 years after I met her, she stopped coming. I went a whole month without hearing from her, until a neighbor from the neighborhood who sometimes stopped by for paracetamol told me bluntly and with great sadness that Dona Letty had passed away at home for natural causes. She was 87 years old. It was a devastating blow. The neighbor was still there and told me where they had buried her and all that, in case I wanted to visit. That night, I don't know how I managed to keep working because the news hit me like a ton of bricks. That week I had a full night shift, the kind that leaves you completely exhausted. In the early morning after 1 a.m., the pharmacy became a cold and silent place, and those days it seemed even stranger. It was under those circumstances that it happened. It was 2:17 in the morning. I know because I had just checked the time on my phone. There was no one at the counter, and the pharmacy was silent again. I couldn't even hear my coworker, so I assumed he'd fallen asleep or something. I was tidying up the chronic medications on the shelf: blood pressure, sugar, cholesterol. Organizing has always calmed me, and I was trying to distract myself with that task. I closed the drawer with the blood pressure monitors, and at that moment, a blast of cold air shot through me from the window to my back, as if someone had opened the access panel we use to pass medications and was blowing air from the street. I immediately realized. I turned around and tried in vain to find an explanation. I was sure it wasn't the air conditioning. In the end, I assumed that somehow the air had seeped in through a crack in the window. I turned around to move on to the next shelf and heard the sharp thud of plastic against the floor. A small box of losartan had slipped off the middle shelf next to my hands, along with a small row of blister packs. It wasn't an avalanche, just a few that fell right next to me for no reason. I bent down to pick them up, and, silly as it sounds, while I was grabbing the blister packs trying to rough up the aluminum, I noticed they were exactly the same ones that Dona Letty always took. I stood up, the pack in my hand, and then I felt a hand. Not a push, not a grab, but a small, gentle hand that rested for a second on my left shoulder, near my neck, with a softness that I interpreted as not wanting to frighten me. I froze, staring at the shelf label. I turned around, my heart in my throat. Of course, there was no one there. The window was still closed, the aisle empty, and my coworker finally appeared at the back of the store, completely unaware of what was happening to me. He noticed me looking at him and gestured as if asking if everything was all right, and I burst into tears. I know it was Dona Letty who manifested that night. I asked my coworker for a few minutes, and since he knew how sad I'd been the last few days, he didn't ask for details or explanations about what was wrong. I went to the back room and checked the security footage on the camera monitor. I saw my back in black and white, my ponytail barely moving, and nothing else. No shadows, no strange lights. Just me suddenly standing still and turning around a few seconds later after picking up some pills from the floor. I don't know why I did it, but I said softly, "Good night, Mrs. Letty," as if I were saying goodbye to her too. I wasn't expecting a response, but there was one. It wasn't a voice or anything like that, but a faint scent I'd never noticed in the pharmacy at that hour. Cologne. Just a second, but enough to be etched in my memory forever. I went to the register, sat down, and continued working for the rest of the night. And from that day on, I felt much calmer. The moment of confusion and doubt also passed thanks to the sudden ringing of the window bell. A taxi driver looking for a Band-Aid, a woman asking for something for her stomach. I went back to my routine and worked until 6 a.m. I accepted that what had happened was real, and over the weekend I visited Doña Letty's grave. It took me a while to find it, but I managed, and I brought her flowers and all that. It's not a story I've shared. I think it's a lovely story. Since then, I visit her grave at least once or twice a month. That way I also visit my grandparents' graves. The kind lady, Letty, was my friend for a short time and almost by accident, but I will always remember her as a sweet and kind person who lived a good life and managed to make my Wednesday nights a little more pleasant. From phantom pharmacists to costumes that walk on their own, the veil between our world and the next seems tragically thin in the sterile glow of a 24-hour light. Remember, the next time you find yourself alone at a pharmacy window late at night, you might not be the only customer, and the help you receive may come from beyond the grave. This has been Horror Sector. Don't forget to subscribe for your weekly dose of terror. Sleep well, if you can.